So in this lesson, I'm going to look at adding simple on-screen controls for a series of balloon-shaped targets here. So if we look, I have some simple nose shapes, and we're particularly going to look at the left shape and up shape, which expands the nostril, a compressed shape, which compresses it, and then a widening shape. So we're going to build an on-screen control for driving those three nostril shapes. So I'm going to start with a Nurbs plane, and then using the UV coordinates of that 1 degree Nurbs plane, use that to drive the various shapes. So an up and down direction will drive the expansion and compression of the nostril, and then the outward direction, whether that's U or V, will drive the that widening of the nose. So once again, let's start with a simple 1 degree Nurbs plane. Create Nurbs primitives plane. Going to reset this. So I'm going to set its axis to Z, which is the forward-facing axis here. Surface degree is linear. This isn't something that needs to deform, so I'm going to make the geometry as simple as possible. We're going to leave our UV patches at 1. I'll hit create, quickly rename this. Okay. Switch to a side view and just quickly move this up into place. Okay, so let's make this a little larger. I'm going to change the width to 1.5. Let's start rotating this thing into place. Basically going to roughly match the angle of this nostril. Okay. That looks good enough. Okay, so with our Nurbs plane, what this gives us is a U and V coordinate. And let's display those quickly. So display, Nurbs components, surface origins, and this shows us, let's hide the polygons for a second. Here's the V direction, the U direction, and then the origin, which is both 0 in U and V. Okay. So now we're going to use, just for this demo, I'm going to use the a couple of locators for the to drive the shapes as well as to derive the UV position. So I'm going to create locator, hit G to repeat that. Quickly rename these so we can distinguish one from the other. So this first one will actually be the controller that the animator will use. So I'll call this Cave01 nose control, and this next will be the geometry constraint to this Nurbs plane. Okay. So I'm going to parent the UV nose locator to the nose control, and then parent the nose control locator to the UV mesh. And since the pivot of that Nurbs plane, the UV plane, since the pivot of that Nurbs plane is right in the center, if I zero out the translation and rotation of the nose controller, it both positions and orients this locator as we would want. Okay. I'm going to unparent this UV locator. Okay. So, a couple of constraints. I'm going to first point constrain this UV locator to the nose controller. And the reason we want to use this nose controller, or I want to use it, is because since it's parented to the UV geometry, its translation values are zeroed, as opposed to this, where the translation values are world space. But we don't want to mess with those, since that would interfere with the deriving the UV coordinates. So I'm going to select the nose controller locator, shift select the nose UV locator, then select constrain point. So they'll always match the position. So now I'm going to create a couple of utility nodes here. Let's clear this out and opening our script editor. The first node we're going to create is a closest point on surface. Create node, closest point on surface. Let's give it a name here. And for those of you who've seen the skinning for feature animation DVD, have seen this same technique used for the UV driver. It's pretty much the same thing. I'm driving the UV coordinates from this Nurbs plane. So we'll create that node. With the node still selected, I'm going to open the connection editor, Window, General Editors, Connection Editor. Load that closest point on surface info node into the inputs, and select the UV Nurbs plane, hit the down arrow once so that the shape node is selected. I'm going to load the shape node into the outputs of the connection editor and scroll down until we see world space. So I'm going to connect the world space of this the shape node of the Nurbs plane to the input surface parameter of the closest point on surface node. Then I'm going to select the nose UV locator, which is sitting in world space but point constrained to the nose control locator. I'm going to load that locator into the outputs and then connect the translate channels into the position attribute of the closest point on surface info node. Okay, so now we're going to create another node, a point on surface info node. Create node, point on surface info. Let's give it a name. Okay, so with that node selected, let's open our connection editor once again. Load that point on surface info node into the inputs of the connection editor. We're going to select the UV locator, which already has the closest point on surface info node connected into it. So that's an easy way to select the closest point on surface info node in the channel box. Load that into the outputs of the connection editor. And we're going to connect the parameter U and V in the results drop-down menu of this closest point on surface info node into the corresponding parameter U and parameter V of the point on surface info node. Next, I'm going to select the Nurbs plane, arrow down so that the shape node is selected, load that into the outputs of the connection editor, and once again connect up the world space of the Nurbs plane to the input surface of the point on surface info node. If I select the point on surface info node and open the attribute editor, we can see we have UV parameterization here. I'm going to copy this tab so that we can always see this. Okay, So I no longer need to see the nose UV locator, so I'm going to turn its visibility off. I'm going to set some limits. So I'm going to template this Nurbs Plane by selecting the Nurbs Plane and opening the Attribute Editor. Go down to the Object Display, open that frame, open the Draw Overrides frame, and then enable overrides, and then select the display type to template. So that way the locator is still selected, but the Nurbs Plane is still templated. So we're going to set some limits on the translation of this locator. So first of all, we'll open the Attribute Editor, go to the Transform node, and in the limit information, we want to make sure that the Translate selections are visible. So first of all, we don't want any translation in the Z-axis. So I'm just going to set these to 0 and then enable them both. So that way we cannot translate this off the Nurbs plane. We're not going to want it to go beyond the 0.5 point in X. So we'll set the minimum to positive 0.5. Let's see here. I'm sorry. We want to set the minimum to 0. I'm thinking of the UV parameter here. Now we could go a little further. Let's say negative 0.25. Basically, we're positioning this exactly where we want it on this Nurbs plane, where we want this control to rest on the character. Okay, so for positive, we don't want it to go beyond the end here, which is 0.74. Let's go 0.75. So now we can see that there are translate X limits for this locator. Now we're going to do the same for Y, which is positive 0.75 and negative 0.75. We'll just enable those two fields and input those values. Okay, so now we have limits on all three of the translate axes. So we can't move it at all in Z. And that's the range of our motion in the Y and X plane. So we can see when we move it in X, we're moving in the U parameter. Therefore, we're moving in the V parameter with the positive and negative Y. Let's hide the rest of these channels. Okay. So now we're going to start connecting these blend shapes, these nostril blend shapes up to this locator with the UV parameterization. So I'm going to select the blend shape node by clicking on the surface, and in the channel box clicking on the blend shape node, then selecting animate, set driven key, set, and option box. So there are nostril blend shapes. And next I'm going to find select this nose UV, and so that I can easily get to the point on surface info node, and then load that into the driver of the set driven key menu. Let's move this over here. Okay. So once again, the outward motion is the parameter U. The up and down are parameter V. So we're going to start with the broadening, or the up shape. So that's positive and V. So I'm going to select parameter V. We're just going to work with the left nostril for now. Select both the up and compress, which will both be driven by the up and down. And in this default pose, we'll set a key. Now just working with the up, I'm going to set the parameter V to positive 1. Set my up shape to positive 1. And then key, the set driven key menu. Okay, let's zero out this control. You can actually lock this Z parameter. Okay, so there we have that. So now for the compress shape, I'm going to go to 0 in the V parameter, select our compress shape, dial that in, key our set driven key tool, okay, so there we have compression and expansion. So lastly, for the parameter U, we're going to use that to drive the wide shape. So in the default, we'll key that. So the wide shape is keyed at 0. We'll translate it in X, which is the U parameter. Select our wide nose shape, activate it to 1, then set our last set driven key. So now what we have is we can compress just while moving on this U and V plane. We can get a fairly organic feel here for how the nostril works. And all these controls are zeroed, so they'll be easily reset. The last step will be simply parenting this Nurbs Plane to the appropriate head joint, and that control will simply follow around with the major deformations or major position of the head joints for this character. Once again, fairly easy, fairly straightforward. Let's go in and hide this locator real quick. Going to turn off its visibility by selecting the shape node, but then display the handle, display, component display, selection handle. Go in and select this selection handle. And play around with these shapes. So you can use another object rather than a locator to drive the positioning of this object on the UV plane. It could be an arrow or a circle, for instance. And so one benefit of this approach is that the controls can be fairly organic depending upon how the shapes are built and work together. And then they're right on the face of the character, so easily accessible by the animator. But one of the downsides that I've heard expressed by animators, but not all animators, is sometimes they take up a lot of screen space if you have particularly large visual controls. But if you keep them fairly small, some animators will like this method. So if it's something that you've never used or that animators in your pipeline have never used, it's something to consider, giving a whirl and seeing how it goes over with your animation. And it's fairly intuitive. Rather than having to access multiple sliders, you can build shapes to give you basically the type of deformation following along with the movement of the control on the UV plane.